Hello, BookTube. Recently, I have reacquainted myself with one of the greatest joys of modern life. That is the Sunday New York Times. For those of you who don't live in America, or maybe aren't familiar with it, the New York Times is the greatest paper in America. It's the paper of record. It is, in some measures, the greatest paper in the world, for good or ill, mostly ill. And every Sunday, the New York Times comes out with a special Sunday Times, which is a great big brick-like wodge of a thing that comes in multiple layers, multiple sections, and is an astonishing feat. Regardless of what you think of its editorial content, it's an astonishing feat to bring out a thing like that every week and never fail. And I have read it from time to time, but in the last 15 years, I fell off the habit of going out and finding it on Sunday. It's a totally inferior thing. I know this is odd coming from me because I'm a big champion of electronic reading, but it's a totally inferior thing to read the electronic Sunday Times or the electronic Times at all. It's entirely superior to just be closeted with this thing away from the pinging distractions of the outside world. The Sunday New York Times has 2 or 3 front sections about national and international news, because of course the news doesn't stop on the weekends, but it also has lots and lots of longer and ruminative sections on the arts, on business, on travel, on health, that sort of, and also on the news, that sort of look back on the week that was. It's a wonderful experience. I don't know why I stopped for so long. It hadn't really occurred to me to go back to the Times because availability is everything. If you want the physical paper, availability is everything. It's prohibitively expensive to subscribe to the thing, or at least it feels that way. And also, that big, huge thing on your front porch is subject to theft and the environment and the squirrels. So really, it's propinquity. It's do you have a place that sells it? And recently, I remembered that not the corner bodega, but the next bodega has the Sunday New York Times, and the next bodega is only another block away. Those of you who maybe aren't familiar with Northeast American culture, a bodega is a corner store that sells a playful mixture of legal and illegal items, and that is fully staffed and constantly attended by hangers-on who can be very interesting to listen to, especially if you're an old white guy who they just never even occurs to them that I might understand Spanish. So I get to hear a lot about myself while I'm actually there. And I just have gotten back into the habit of going to the next bodega and getting the Sunday Times. Then you bring it back, you prepare some breakfast, and you just sink into it like a Turkish bath. And it's wonderful. It's a wonderful experience. And I thought we'd go through the pertinent parts of it together because, of course, I mean, I read all the sections except maybe business, but the sections that are right at the heart of the thing, the sections that are the most layers in, are the kernel at the heart of my Sunday New York Times reading experiences. Of course, the Sunday New York Times book review, a pull-out book review section that is the pinnacle of my profession. Again, for good or ill, I'm not saying that the best reviews are written there, or the most trenchant, or certainly the longest. But it is nevertheless a career thing. It's career making for someone to write a review for that pull out book section, and it can be career making, or even in bad old days, career ending, for someone to get a good or bad review in the pull out Sunday New York Times book review. So that's right, literally at the heart of the paper, because the paper is folded over in sections. The shopkeepers have to fold it and assemble it before you even get there, before they open for business, which is kind of dodgy. It doesn't come that way. It doesn't come assembled to the bodegas or anywhere else. So it's kind of dodgy because if the person has 10 other things to do or is badly hungover, then your Sunday Times might not have all of the sections that you want. It might have 2 of one and not of the other. But the way it's folded in is at the very heart. When you dig past all the layers, that is the center of it, is the book review. So I read through the Sunday New York Times this morning, and it was glorious. It was fantastic, just fantastic. I have a way of doing it. Everybody has their own way of reading the Sunday New York Times. Mine is to read it dutifully from the first page. I've known people, and especially families, who they get the Sunday New York Times and they just, each one pulls out their own section: business to you, travel to you, the op-ed section to you, the book section to you, and then maybe there's some limited sharing afterwards. And I've also known individuals, single individuals, who get the Sunday New York Times. They pay the whole amount of money for it. I think the thing now is $6. It's worth it. It's very much worth it. It's a whole mini education in one gigantic, beautifully designed package. But I've known some people who would get the Sunday Times and pull out one or two sections and just not even look at the rest of it. But what I do is just open the thing up and just read it page by page. So I do the news first, the news features, the opinions, the arts, theater, all that sort of stuff. And the only artificial thing is that I save the book review for last, because that's the thing that has the most of my attention. I want to see who's reviewing what and why and what they're saying about it. And I thought we'd go through that, those pertinent parts together today. Before I got to the book review, I actually was in the op-ed section, the Sunday Review, and found a book article. Now, that's a bad idea. That is a very bad idea. In the op-ed section, if someone is writing a book article, it's not going to please a bookish person. Okay. So I knew that when I got to this thing. I knew that it was going to be pandering to non-readers. The book review itself is completely different. It is for readers, but anything that you find on an op-ed page is going to be... So I shouldn't have read it, but I did, and I regret it. It's let me see if I can show it to you here. It's called Why You Should Binge Read. And it's by Ben Dolnick, whose most recent book is the Ghost Notebooks. And like so many New York Times op-eds, it starts with a lie. I know that's the way of things. It's just the nature of the business, but it's still depressing. He starts off with, one night a couple of summers ago, the power went out, and unable to watch Netflix or engage in my customary internet fugue, I lit a candle and picked up a thriller by Ruth Rendell. For the first time in as long as I could remember, my sole source of entertainment for an evening was going to be a book. That didn't happen. That power outage didn't happen. If it had, he would still have spent his time on his phone. When the power outage goes out, you don't automatically make plans for the whole evening to have no power. You assume you'll have it back in 15 minutes or an hour. And also, if you are going to read a book, you don't light one candle. You light as many candles as you can find. One candle is extremely uncomfortable to read by. It's just, none of that is true. None of that makes any sense. And when you read something like that in a New York Times op-ed, you know that the writer is setting up an entire world of straw men. And that can be very annoying. And it gets on from there. And yes, just as you'd expect, it was wonderful. It was cozy. The internet is terrible. But what struck me more than that night's general delightfulness was how much my experience of reading the book was influenced by the speed with which I was suddenly moving through it. To that point, I'd been reading the book the way I usually read books. That he means up until that point. To that point means he's addressing that point. It's to that point and up until that point are not interchangeable. It's just meant to sound folksy. That's all. Because he figures book people, they must be folksy. Which is to say that he'd been reading them in 5 to 10 minute snatches before bed. And I'd been more or less enjoying it, watching, but I'd been enjoying it the way a person enjoys hors d'oeuvres at a cocktail party. The way you enjoy hors d'oeuvres at a cocktail party. Before my storm-induced Rendell marathon, suddenly this has changed. Suddenly he's reading more than one Rendell book at the same, in sequence. That's what the thing is about, binge reading, although binge reading is never mentioned in this early part. It's just, we go from him picking up a Ruth Rendell novel and reading it by one candlelight while his power was out, to reading all the Ruth Rendell novels by candlelight, that same poor overworked candle. But he says, I've been reading the wrong way. John Gardner, the literary critic, and John Gardner was also a novelist, but that's okay, wrote that the job of a novelist is to create, quote, a vivid and continuous dream for the reader. But I'd somehow developed a case of readerly sleep apnea. I'd gotten into the habit of consuming novels so fitfully that I was all but sealed off from their pleasures. I had accidentally discovered one of the great disadvantages of books, a medium that is not exactly short on disadvantages at the moment. There is no team of brilliant and vaguely sinister engineers cooking up ways to get you binge reading. There is no autoplay technology frictionlessly delivering you from one chapter of a novel you're reading to the next. There's only you, alone, in the silence of your room with a chapter break before you and your phone cooing at you from the dresser. No one could blame you for putting down the Count of Monte Cristo back on the bedside table where it spends its days. Maybe, like a long-forgotten glass of water, it will evaporate of its own accord. But in book after book, if you do push on through one chapter break and then on through the chapter break after that, something amazing happens. And it goes on from there. It's just tooth-grindingly awful. And when I was reading it, I was thinking, okay, well, A, this is your own fault for reading about news in the op-ed section of the Time, which is designed to irritate people. Every piece in the op-ed section of the Time is designed to irritate people. The first one, The Likability Trap, is by Claire Bond Potter. And the opening paragraph is, if the supposedly unlikable Hillary Clinton didn't break the hardest glass ceiling in 2016, she made enough cracks in it to encourage others to try again. 6 women are competing for the Democratic nomination today. But guess what? We don't seem to like them either. Because Hillary Clinton won the vote by a huge margin, and there is no polling that says that we did. Anyway, the op-ed section is meant to irritate, and so I should have avoided that article. But instead, when I was reading it, my first reaction was, okay, well, either you are a millennial, and the most obnoxious kind of millennial, a 90s kid. I mean, not to slight any 90s kids that turned out okay, but 90s kids are kids who came to their awareness in the 90s. Not that they were born then, but that they came to their awareness then. And the worst of 90s kids, the stereotypical ones that I'm talking about, have cultural sleep apnea worse than any other generation that I have ever known in American history. They don't just think that they started paying attention to the world and everything that's in it the day they entered middle school. They literally think that the world started on that day. And everything that they've noticed since they entered middle school, the first day they entered middle school until now, when they have, a middle management job in IT, that everything that's happened between that date and today happened for the first time. And, I have a very busy life, but what I'd really like to do is take a moment from my busy schedule to point this out to you, because otherwise, without me pointing it out, you wouldn't have noticed. So I figured this guy had to be a 90s kid, because he's writing, either he had to be a 90s kid or he had to be paid by the Times to write as if he were one, because he's writing an article in which his big discovery is that in order to get through a book, you have to keep turning the pages. that there's nothing to get you from the end of one chapter to the beginning of another chapter except yourself. And so I made the mistake of Googling him, and he is indeed a 90s kid. I don't know why I bothered. But then we moved on. Then I moved on to the heart of my Times reading experience, which is the book review. And there are all sorts of concerns that go into reading the book review. All sorts of stuff, especially if it's your profession, if it's your life. Like, for instance, as silly and shallow as it is, you want to know what made the front page of the New York Times Sunday Book Review. Not just the book, but the reviewer. And in this case, the front. Let me see if you can do this. The front page, the review is by it's the Flight Portfolio by Julie Oringer, and the review is by Cynthia Ozick. And the Flight Portfolio is a kind of a critical darling of the moment. It's getting lots and lots of press. Sam Sachs at the Wall Street Journal gave it a standalone review. He almost never does that. And this is a long one. The front page review from the book review will be the longest review in the book review. It's the only one with a jump page, so it'll just go on forever and ever. And there are other politics involved too. The New York Times Book Review, the editors behind it have always had a kind of a vague idea of matching a reviewer with a book. And I've had a troubled relationship with that idea from the beginning, because in one way it's a good idea, because if somebody writes magical realism Bildungsroman, you don't want to give that to a historian of Byzantine currency. They might read those things every once in a blue moon on their own, but probably not. And they won't understand enough about the world of the book in order to give it any kind of review, positive or negative. So on one hand, I understand, the game, the wonderful little parlor game of matching reviewer with review, but on the other hand, I think that it can harm things enormously, because it isn't just that the Times is reaching out to people who have similar interests to the book that they're proposing this person review. It's that they have a financial stake. They are reviewing a competitor. And I don't know how you remove that completely from the equation. I don't know how you do it. And yet in every issue of the New York Times Sunday Book Review, you have author after author pretty much daring you to even insinuate that they might have a motive for disliking a book, aside from the linguistic or artistic merits of that book. I don't know if I'm making that point clearly. The point I'm trying to make is that Julie Oringer and Cynthia Ozick are competitors. Now, nobody wants to call them that. Nobody wants to talk that way. Certainly Cynthia Ozick would probably bridle at the idea. But nevertheless, if her new book and this new book are together on the stands at the Strand, they're competing with each other. And also, the person who is going to have the most dyed-in-wool opinions about what does and doesn't work in a novel is going to be a novelist. And I don't know that that's fair to a reader who's neither. To a reader who's not a novelist, I'm not sure that it's fair for them to go into a book review wanting to read a review of a book and maybe get the queasy sense 2/3 of the way through the review that what they've wandered into is something far dicier than that. Insider baseball of a type that doesn't particularly care how it reviews the book. So it's always a gamble. And this, the editors of the book review have, from time immemorial, always compounded that gamble by, in addition to talking a lot and caring a lot about matching reviewer and book, also care very much about gets. They love a good get for the review, and that has as much to do with the celebrity of the reviewer as it does with anything like their competence to review the book. There's one of those in here. Fortunately, it isn't a pig's breakfast, but when you get the book review, I used to study the table of contents in order to prep my outrage, but I don't do that anymore. Instead, I go through it page by page and see not only who's reviewing what and what made it to the pinnacle of my profession, but also the full color ads. These are very expensive. That's the down payment on a condo. So when you see a full color ad for David McCullough, for instance, or this one, very nice to see, a full page color ad for the new Frederick Douglass biography. Fantastic. But I move on from there. They have regular features like any pull-out book section does. They have the letters column, of course. They have Buy the Book, where they talk to an author about the books that they're reading recently or bookish thoughts they might have. The letters column can always be fun. The letters to the New York Times are fun anyway because it's an extremely literate readership. It's always Manhattan or Greater New York that writes in the letters, and it's an extremely literate readership and also extremely touchy and often totally unaware of how they're coming off in the letters column. I think the people who put the letters column together must have a great deal of sort of po-faced fun at letting a letter hang itself. Like, for instance, there's one here today. Donald Boudreau, who is a professor of economics at George Mason University, writes that in reviewing Falter, Jared Diamond gently scolds its author, Bill McKibben, for writing in a manner unconvincing to those who don't already agree with McKibben and Diamond that humanity faces an existential environmental crisis. As someone who doesn't believe that any such crisis looms, I here offer advice on how our environmentalists can make themselves more convincing. Stop focusing only on capitalism's environmental costs and acknowledge its many environmental benefits. So the writer of this letter has opened his letter by saying that he does not believe there is any kind of an environmental crisis facing the world today. He opens his letter by saying that. Millions of people in India facing a typhoon the cyclone the size of which no one has ever seen before. half of the Midwest underwater, all of the American West on fire all of last summer, and that's going to be worse this year. And also, I might point out that Boston is currently experiencing its 281st consecutive day of winter. That also is completely unprecedented. There was more rain in Boston in April than has ever been recorded in history. Anyway, he goes on and he gets better. This gets precious. Considering the anxiety suffered by Diamond and McKibben over asphalt roof shingles, according to Diamond, McKibben explains how their manufacture and distribution all now in explains how their manufacture and distribution depends on multiple big systems, all now at increasing risk because of their scale, complexity, and susceptibility to disruption. And then he goes on for what he considers to be the killer point. Forget that this product has been used for over a century without disruption. So it's always worked in the past. So that's prima facie evidence that it will always work in the future. Yeah, that's very sound reasoning. Instead, recognize that the low price of asphalt shingles helps to ensure that people in capitalist countries have a hard roof over their head. Before the industrial age, thatched roofs were much more common and posed immediate environmental hazards to those living beneath them. It would be refreshing if, for once, environmentalists like Diamond and McKibben acknowledged that this and many other ways that industrialization makes everyday human life cleaner and safer. I can't help but think that such a letter was posted purely for readers to laugh at this guy. That's all. It certainly would have long precedence. There is a long precedence for letters columns to do that, just completely disinterestedly, without pointing, without whoopee cushions or anything like that. Post an absurd letter just to have people laugh at its writer. But anyway, then we move on. We move on throughout the review. We have Dominic Smith reviewing Henry Himself by Stuart Onan and doing a wonderful job. One of the great things that you want in a book review, at this level of the game certainly, is for it to make you change your mind. I read the book and thought that it was cheap pandering, and this Dominic Smith makes a point that its wistful, elegiac tone is very much intentional and isn't schmaltzy, and maybe is worth another read. That was wonderful. It was a wonderful experience. But then we have the get of the issue. We have Paul Krugman. The economist Paul Krugman, who is he's a columnist for the Times. He's a talking head poobah when it comes to all matters of economics, and he reviews at full length, the full page, Firefighting: The Financial Crisis and Its Lessons, which is a new book by Ben Bernanke, Timothy Geithner, and Henry Paulson Jr. Three people who know a lot about financial crises, and this is the review right there. And he trots the book around. He is an insider. These people are insiders. That's one of the risks you run when you get a get, or a like-minded novelist, or you conscript a novelist to review a book by her protege. One of the things you get is that they'll have a thumb on the scale and you won't know it. An ordinary reader won't know it. That's why I infinitely prefer. I mean, it's impossible to avoid when you get to this level of reviewership. It's almost impossible to avoid, but I infinitely prefer the critics who aren't clubbing with each other, the critics who aren't going to book launches with each other, the critics who don't play squash with each other and know each other and depend on each other, and that whole kind of high school cafeteria type thing. It becomes incestuous in a way that hurts the ultimate beneficiary of these reviews, which is, of course, you. It's the customer. These things aren't supposed to be written for... But anyway, I don't know how you could do it otherwise. I mean, you couldn't exactly expect, for instance, the fiction critic for a major New York newspaper to be a kind of hermit. Now, could you? But anyway, at the crucial point, Krugman writes, should we be worried about another financial crisis? Because half this book is about that. Yes, the authors say, in a final chapter that is downright scary. Banking, they argue, is actually less risky than it was, thanks to financial reforms that, while far short of what should have been done, have nevertheless led to safer practices. But crises still happen, and when they do, the firefighting abilities of policymakers will have been gravely compromised. And it's not even clear whether they would try to fight the fire, or at any rate have any idea what they were doing. The authors are too nice to say this, but today's top economic officials seem to be systematically drawn from the ranks of those who got everything wrong during the crisis of 2008. The failure of Bear Stearns was the first solid indication of how much trouble we were in. Donald Trump has just chosen David Malpass, Bear's chief economist at the time, to head the World Bank. Larry Kudlow, now the administration's top economist, ridiculed, quote, bubbleheads who claimed that housing prices were out of whack, then praised Paulson for refusing to bail out Lehman just hours before financial markets went into full meltdown. In other words, we seem to have learned the wrong lessons from our brush with disaster. As a result, when the next crisis comes, it's likely to play out even worse than the last one. Isn't that a happy thought? So we move from their big expert, to one of their regulars that I just love. I, of course, just love her. And she is one of the few readouts left for this particular kind of book writing. It's a kind of book writing that I have had occasion to champion against a hostile audience in the last 15 years, and it's mystery writing. When you have a columnist who writes about new mystery novels, in this case, it's Marilyn Stasio, who writes the crime column for the New York Times Book Review, and has done so for a long time, longer than longer than Ben Dolnick's been alive. And it's not just that she writes about multiple books in her column. It's the way that crime novelists tend to do this. It's a dying art. We at Open Letters Review, the online literary journal where I have the honor to be an editor, we have such a person. We have Irma Heldman, who does an exact Marilyn Stasio kind of column. And when you read a column like this, she does 4 murder mysteries: The Paris Diversion by Chris Pavone, Black Mountain by Laird Barron, The Unquiet Heart by Katie Walsh, and The Woman in the Blue Cloak by Dion Meyer. And she does not review them. That's the whole key to this kind of crime writing, is that she doesn't review them. These kind of crime writers don't do that. Instead, it's a column just talking about the books, telling you about them, maybe quoting a bit from them, maybe a wisecrack here and there, but no critical evaluation of any kind. And in some of the bad days of the old Open Letters Monthly, I was constantly going to bat for Irma for doing that exact same thing. And I was going to bat with people who really read widely enough to know better, to know that this is a legitimate kind of writing about books. Used to be the only way that people wrote about crime novels or pretty much anything else. If you take a tour of the book review coverage of the major 250 going concern American newspapers from, let's say, 100 years ago, you would find a lot of that kind of roundup and talk rather than criticism. And I like it. I like it just fine. And she does a great job, so it's always great to see. Then we get to one of my bête noirs, Karl Overgaard. He has a new book called So Much Longing in So Little Space, about Edvard Munch, the artist Edvard Munch. And Siri Hustvedt, the novelist, reviews his book. And at the end of her review, she makes a tangled, intelligent observation about its shortcomings. She writes that that Knausgaard displays confidence about theories he has misunderstood. After telling the reader that Michel Foucault's The Order of Things came as a revelation to him, that he still believes in it, he argues that in the same breath that the true is always the same. Foucault would not have been pleased. There are many sources to which Knausgaard could turn to bolster his position on truth, but they are not in the book. The error is important rather than incidental because the writer frames his questions as ultimate ones about the making of art and ushers philosophy into the book. The irony may be that Knausgaard has been forced into the very channel of consensus he recognizes so clearly as a consensus that has elevated him to a status that, if not autocratic, is surely heroic. I know that's rather stuffily put, but believe it or not, that is a haymaker that she just landed, and she gets better. The fact that the consensus arrived with the publication of My Struggle, a voluminous novel of automatic writing, may have had its dangers. Its many strengths do not lie in its intellectual rigor. What she's saying, unless I'm much mistaken, what she's saying in those wonderfully elegant lines is that Knausgaard is not only dumb, but totally unqualified to review a book. And I totally agree. But then I want to, we'll hurry on here a bit. There are all sorts of other great things in here. As every issue of the book review is worth the price of the paper alone. It's just, with the Sunday Times, you get so much else. But you get lots of things here, including there's the twofold experience that you get when you read as many book reviews as I do. You get an intelligent critic who likes something that you didn't like, and an intelligent critic who dislikes something that you liked. I got them on facing pages in this particular issue. Robert Alter, the great translator of the Bible, reviews the new biography of Martin Buber and likes it, and I thought it was a snooze fest. And Jennifer Croft reviews Fernando Aramburu's Homeland, recently translated into English, and doesn't like it when I thought it was brilliant. So, and that's wonderful. It's wonderful when you get that and you can't ignore it. In either case, where all the best book reviews do that. They make you a little less sure of your own certainties, and maybe prompt you to pull the book down and go at it again. But you have all the rest of this. You have the bestseller list, of course, which are some of the things that book publicists look at first. The mighty New York Times bestseller lists are the pulse of the industry. You have people, a steady column where writers will talk about the past. They'll talk about the week in books, its sales, its phenomenon, or whatnot. In this case, we have Marjorie Engel doing children's books, and she does a really, really good job. But there is, we also have the jump. We have the jump of Cynthia Ozick's review of the Flight Portfolio, because it's not just one page review, it jumps into the middle of the book review. And her ultimate conclusion about the book, it's about a man who saves Jewish refugees from the growing menace of the Nazis. And her ultimate conclusion about it is odd, to say the least, making me wonder if maybe the review would have been better handed to somebody else, somebody maybe not quite so high profile. She writes, for instance, Varian Fry is the main character of the Flight Portfolio, and she says the mind of Varian Fry in the Flight Portfolio is Oranger's mind. And how, in a war between history and imagination, can we deny her that? And just when you're thinking, well, of course you can deny her that. She's not supposed to do that. She goes on. She says, literature is everywhere rife with parallel precedents. Shakespeare's Henry V is Shakespeare's mind. No, it's not. And how do you know? Tolstoy's Napoleon is Tolstoy's mind. No, it's not. And how do you know? Then why should it matter that Oranger's vertiginous unscrollings of events and intent, unfolding in the south of France in the very pit of Vichy brutality, are chiefly her own? But it does matter. Today we have no stake in the Battle of Agincourt. We have no stake in the Napoleonic Wars. But we do have a stake in whatever touches on the historical integrity of the Holocaust, now increasingly denied, diminished, demoted, misapplied, perverted, derided, or else utterly erased. And what of the recreation of a historical figure crucial to the necessary truth of a half-forgotten reality? That is just blather. That is just hot air blather. We do not have any more of a connection to the Holocaust than we do to Agincourt or the Napoleonic Wars. And elevating it saying, well, I mean, what is the context of those comparisons? It's saying, if you want to be historically inaccurate about Napoleon, go right ahead, but not the Holocaust. It's either one or the other. And if you preface it with inept readings like that Napoleon's mind in War and Peace is Tolstoy's mind? What on earth? But her objection is that Varian Fry of the historical record is different from the Varian Fry that she encounters in this historical novel about him. And that, I mean, the first impulse I have when I read something like that is to wonder whether or not the author ever reads historical fiction. And you don't want to think that. In the marquee, the front page review of the New York Times Book Review, you don't want your reaction to be when you get to the end of the review, well, okay, I'm not sure that the reviewer here, in the marquee place of the whole of the literary world, actually understands anything about the genre that she's reviewing. You don't want to get to that point. But right in the center of the issue was something that, of course, magnetized my attention. It's the essay. And in this essay, it is, Why So Many Books About Dogs? Why so many books about dogs? It is written by Vanessa Woods and Brian Hare. And I'm going to read you the beginning, because we're going to come back to a point I made earlier. What would the world be like without music or rivers or the green and tender grass? The poet Mary Oliver asked in her book Dog Songs. What would this world be like without dogs? A world without dogs is impossible to imagine. Our relationship with them predates the written word, agriculture, and civilization. They were our hunting buddies, bed warmers, and sometimes, if not much else was around, our dinner. As dogs crept into our homes, surfing kitchen counters and sleeping on the sofa, our focus was practical, managing the animals with which 60 million American households share space. That's about 13 million more households than the number cohabiting with the next most popular pet, cats. Until surprisingly recently, most dog books were assiduously pragmatic: how to choose them, train them, and care for them. And those of you who are maybe of a certain age and maybe love dogs, maybe love dog literature, have your jaws on the floor right now. And I'm going to make things worse because I'm going to traumatize you all over again and repeat that line. It is almost unbelievable. Even in the whole of the gigantic 1,000 pages of the Sunday New York Times, is the most absurd line that I read. Until surprisingly recently, most dog books were assiduously pragmatic: how to choose them, train them, and care for them. When I read such an absolutely absurdly incorrect line like that, my immediate thought, again, is that I was dealing with two 90s kids, and that the reason they think that all dog books started in the late 90s, around the turn of the 2000s, is because that's when they started reading. And have not bothered. They would be incensed, deeply insulted, if you said maybe you should read a little earlier than the day you entered middle school. And so I Googled them. And it is absolutely true. It is, once again, absolutely true. It is a pair of 90s kids saying, yeah, until I got into middle school, I don't know why people didn't write about the interiority of dogs. Why didn't they write about the experience of knowing them as people or loving them as friends? It's amazing that it wasn't until I started paying attention that started happening. And then they go on to talk about some recent books about dogs. They even say that the dog behavioral studies, cognitive behavioral studies, basically started on the day they entered middle school. It's just so it was kind of funny. But that was the New York Times book review for this week. In a kind of a nutshell, some ups and downs like that I just wanted to share with you because it's an intensely bookish experience, and I share my bookish experiences on this channel now. I just do. In fact, I don't know of a bookish experience that gets more bookish than going out on a Sunday morning, getting the Sunday New York Times, and reading the Sunday New York Times book review, the pull-out section that so few newspapers can afford to do anymore. The Journal does one. The Washington Post, I don't even know if the book world is a pull-out section anymore. It might not be. The Christian Science Monitor used to have a pull-out book section every week. They don't anymore. Almost nobody does. Newspapers are busy trying to survive, much less having one of these. And there's a peculiar kind of integrity to something like this, being a world unto itself. So I wanted to share it with you. And I enjoyed it, so I may do it again. Maybe at shorter length. But anyway, I'm going to wrap this up. But I will see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.